Around 1200 BC, palaces burned, kingdoms vanished, and letters stopped arriving. It sounds like an ancient apocalypse. The archaeology tells a stranger story. At the end of the Bronze Age, some of the most powerful states in the Eastern Mediterranean did not leave us a clean explanation for what happened. They left burned rooms, broken walls, abandoned capitals, clay tablets baked hard by the fires that destroyed the buildings around them. That is why the phrase ancient apocalypse is useful only if we handle it carefully. It can describe how the world felt to people living through it. But it should not become a shortcut for fantasy, lost super civilizations, or a single cinematic disaster. The real story is more interesting. Around 1200 BC, the palace world that connected Egypt, the Hittites, Cyprus, Syria, Canaan, and Mycenaean Greece began to fracture. Not everywhere at once, not for one reason, and not always permanently. Some places burned, some were abandoned, some adapted. Egypt survived but weakened. Assyria survived. Cyprus changed. Small kingdoms and local powers rose where great palaces had failed. So the question is not, what ended civilization? The question is, what kind of system had they built, and why did so many parts of it fail so close together? To understand the collapse, start a century earlier, before the fires. The late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean was not a collection of isolated kingdoms. It was a network. Royal courts exchanged letters. Rulers called each other brother. Ships carried copper, tin, glass, resin, ivory, weapons, jewelry, and finished prestige goods across the sea. The Uluburun shipwreck, found off the coast of southern Turkey, is the clearest archaeological snapshot of that world. Its cargo included copper oxide ingots, tin, glass ingots, Canaanite jars, ebony, ivory, weapons, weights, and luxury goods from many regions. This was not random trade. It was a system of palaces, merchants, diplomats, and specialists moving materials that no single kingdom could fully supply by itself. Bronze required copper and tin. Palaces required grain, scribes, tax labor workshops, soldiers, ships, and legitimacy. Rulers depended on networks that made them rich, but those same networks made them vulnerable. A drought in one region, a war in another, a broken route at sea, a rebellion inland, and suddenly pressure could move across the system. The Bronze Age did not collapse because it was primitive. It collapsed in part because it was complex. At Mycenaean Pylos in southwestern Greece, archaeologists found linear B tablets in the palace destruction layer. These tablets were not literature. They were administration. Lists of people, livestock, textiles, offerings, bronze wheels, weapons, and obligations. They show a palace trying to count its world. That is one of the most important facts about 1200 BC. The palaces were not just royal houses. They were engines of collection and redistribution. They gathered resources from the countryside, processed them through workshops, and sent them back out as rations, equipment, gifts, and political display. This made them powerful. It also made them brittle. If the palace burned, the archive disappeared. If the scribes stopped writing, the administrative memory disappeared. If the king could no longer collect grain or metal, the workshops and soldiers and dependent laborers were exposed. The linear B tablets from Pylos survived precisely because fire baked them. A disaster preserved the paperwork of a system that was failing. When we talk about collapse, we are not only talking about ruined walls, we are talking about the breakdown of institutions that made those walls meaningful. The most famous explanation is the Sea Peoples. Egyptian inscriptions from the reign of Ramesses III describe enemies coming from the north, moving by land and sea with families, ships, carts, and warriors. At Medinet Habu, the temple walls show battles and captives, and the text presents the pharaoh as the defender who crushed the invaders. The source is real. The problem is how we use it. Egyptian royal inscriptions are not neutral news reports. They are monuments of kingship. They turn danger into royal victory. They name groups, but they do not give us a full ethnographic map. They describe Egypt's crisis, not the entire Mediterranean collapse. The Sea Peoples were part of the story. Raiding, migration, naval warfare, and displaced communities mattered, but they cannot explain every destruction layer from Greece to Anatolia to the Levant. Some places were destroyed before Egypt's famous Year 8 battle. Some were abandoned without clear evidence of invasion. Some regions changed without disappearing. So the better question is not, did the Sea Peoples do it? The better question is, what conditions produced movements, raids, and wars large enough for Egypt to carve them into stone? On the Syrian coast stood Ugarit, one of the best documented kingdoms of the Late Bronze Age. Its archives preserve royal letters, legal texts, myths, trade documents, and diplomatic correspondence. They show a literate, wealthy city tied into the world of Hatti, Cyprus, Egypt, and the Levant. Then the city was destroyed. The last tablets are haunting because they show a state under pressure, not a world that simply ends without warning. Letters speak of enemy ships, missing troops, and requests for help. The famous image is not a sudden apocalypse from nowhere. It is a government trying to manage an emergency while its options narrow. Archaeology at sites linked to the Ugarit kingdom has helped date the terminal destruction in the northern Levant to the early 12th century BC. In some places, the evidence points to violent destruction. In others, the pattern is more complicated. Ugarit matters because it gives us both text and ash. It shows that the collapse was not only a later historical reconstruction. People inside the system knew something was going wrong. They sent messages, they waited for ships, they asked for help. And then the archive stopped. The Hittite Empire had been one of the great powers of the Late Bronze Age. Its capital, Hattusa, stood in central Anatolia behind walls, gates, temples, archives, and royal monuments. The Hittites fought Egypt at Kadesh. They ruled vassals. They negotiated treaties. They controlled a vast inland empire. Around 1200 BC, that imperial system broke apart. But Hattusa is a warning against simple stories. The city did burn, but many scholars argue that the royal court and much of the state apparatus had already left before the final fire. That means the end of Hattusa may not have been one dramatic sack. It may have been evacuation, fragmentation, and only then destruction. Recent tree ring and isotope work from central Anatolia adds another layer. It identifies a severe multi-year drought around 1198 to 1196 BC, roughly coincident with the Hittite collapse. That does not mean drought alone destroyed the empire. The nature study itself is careful. Climate contributed, but did not solely cause the collapse. Still, imagine an inland empire dependent on grain, animals, roads, tax flows, and political obedience, facing 3 years of serious drought. The center could not hold forever. Climate evidence is one of the strongest improvements in how we talk about the Bronze Age collapse. Tree rings, isotopes, pollen records, and lake or alluvial data suggest that parts of the eastern Mediterranean and Near East experienced serious aridity around the transition from the Late Bronze Age to the Iron Age. But drought is not a magic key. A dry year does not automatically destroy a kingdom. Many ancient societies stored grain, shifted herds, moved labor, prayed, taxed, traded, negotiated, or fought through bad seasons. Resilience was real. The danger comes when environmental stress meets a system already carrying other pressures. If a palace depends on steady harvests, imported metals, obedient vassals, working ports, and predictable tribute, then a drought can do more than reduce crops. It can expose every weak joint in the machine. People move, armies go unpaid, grain shipments become political weapons, local rulers stop obeying distant kings, merchants avoid dangerous routes, refugees and raiders may be the same people at different moments. That is why the archaeology points away from a single cause. Climate stress was probably one major force. It mattered because of the kind of world it struck. The map of the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC is full of destruction layers. Mycenaean palaces in Greece, Hittite centers in Anatolia, cities in the Levant, sites on Cyprus. Some burn, some are damaged, some are abandoned. Some continue, but in changed form. It is tempting to connect every fire with one marching army. The archaeology does not allow that. Destruction layers tell us that something violent happened at a site. They do not automatically tell us who did it, whether the attackers were outsiders or locals, whether the fire was war, revolt, accident, or cleanup, or whether the destruction caused the political collapse or followed it. This is where careful language matters. Ancient apocalypse is a powerful phrase because the evidence is dramatic. Burned palaces are dramatic. Vanished scripts are dramatic. Abandoned capitals are dramatic. But real archaeology is not a movie trailer. It is pattern recognition under uncertainty. The collapse was not one night. It was a century of regional crisis, local decisions, cascading failures, and transformations that looked different from one site to another. Bronze is an alloy. It needs copper and tin. Copper was available in places like Cyprus. Tin was rarer and often had to move over long distances. That meant late Bronze Age power depended on routes, ships, contracts, port cities, and political trust. The Uluburun shipwreck shows what that world looked like before the collapse, a floating concentration of international wealth. Metal ingots, glass, luxury goods, weights, tools, weapons, and personal objects moving through a connected sea. Now imagine that network under pressure. If ports are unsafe, cargoes stop. If palaces fall, elite demand changes. If vassal kingdoms rebel, routes close. If drought produces famine, grain and ships become strategic. If raiders appear, merchants become cautious or armed. No one has to destroy every city for the system to fail. They only have to make the system unreliable. And once reliability is gone, palaces built around predictable flows of goods and obligations become weaker. This is why a trade diagram can explain more than a battle scene. The Bronze Age collapse was not only about who attacked whom, it was about what happened when the circuits of a world economy stopped working. The human part of the collapse is the hardest to see clearly. Egyptian reliefs show enemies with ships, carts, families, and distinctive equipment. Some texts describe groups moving through lands before reaching Egypt. Archaeology shows new material cultures appearing in some regions, old sites shrinking, and new settlements growing. But migration in the ancient world was not one thing. A hungry farming family, a band of armed raiders, displaced mercenaries, refugees with carts, and ambitious war leaders could all become part of the same movement. The labels used by Egyptian scribes do not always tell us where people were born, what language they spoke, or why they moved. They tell us how Egypt categorized enemies in a royal victory text. That does not make the movement imaginary. It makes it complicated. The better model is pressure and opportunity. As old powers weakened, some communities fled danger, some seized land, some raided, some served as soldiers, and some built new identities in the ruins of the old order. Collapse was not only something that happened to people, it was also something people did, survived, and reorganized. Egypt is the reason the Sea Peoples became famous. At Medinet Habu, Ramesses III presented himself as the king who stopped the northern invaders. The reliefs are spectacular: ships, archers, prisoners, hand-to-hand combat, and the disciplined order of Egypt defeating chaos. But victory inscriptions can hide weakness. Egypt did not disappear around 1200 BC. That matters. It proves the collapse was not universal and not identical everywhere. But Egypt's empire in the Levant receded. Its economy came under strain, and the new kingdom gradually lost the reach it had once held. Survival is not the opposite of collapse. Sometimes survival means contraction. The Egyptian evidence also reminds us that states narrate crises in ways that serve power. Ramesses did not carve a systems analysis into his temple. He carved a royal victory. Archaeology has to place that monument beside other evidence: destroyed cities, abandoned capitals, trade disruption, climate proxies, letters from frightened kings, and local continuities after the fires. The wall tells us Egypt won a battle. It does not tell us why the world that produced the battle was falling apart. The phrase collapse can mislead us because it sounds final. Around 1200 BC, several palace systems ended. Some scripts disappeared from use. Royal archives stopped. Monumental building declined in some regions. Trade changed. Populations moved. Political geography fractured. But people did not vanish. Farmers kept farming. Potters kept making vessels. Local communities adapted. New towns appeared. Old identities changed. Phoenician cities, Aramaean kingdoms, Neo-Hittite states, Israelite highland settlements, Iron Age Cyprus, and post-palatial Greece all emerged from the transformed world after the Bronze Age. This is why modern collapse studies increasingly talk about resilience, transformation, and vulnerability, not only disaster. For the palace elites, the end may have felt like the end of the world. For people outside those palaces, the story could be different. Some suffered, some migrated, some lost protection, some gained room to maneuver when old rulers fell. The archaeological record does not give us one human experience. It gives us a landscape after a storm. Broken centers, surviving edges, new roots, new powers, and old memories reassembled into a different age. So what really happened around 1200 BC? The honest answer is a cascade. The late Bronze Age world was wealthy, literate, diplomatic, and interconnected. It was also dependent on fragile flows: grain, metals, ships, tribute, scribes, armies, legitimacy, and climate conditions, stable enough for all of that to continue. Then multiple stresses converged. Some regions faced drought and famine. Some states fought wars, some routes became unsafe. Some palaces burned, some vassals broke away. Some people moved as refugees, raiders, migrants, or soldiers. Some kings won battles but lost empires. Some centers survived by becoming smaller and different. That is why no single explanation works. Not just sea peoples, not just drought, not just earthquakes, not just rebellion, not just trade collapse. The phrase ancient apocalypse works only if we remember that apocalypse originally means revelation. What the archaeology reveals is not a lost advanced civilization or a sudden end of humanity. It reveals a complex world reaching its limits, failing unevenly, and giving birth to the Iron Age. The late Bronze Age collapse is powerful because it feels familiar. A connected world, specialized economies, long-distance supply chains, climate stress, refugees, political fragility, leaders turning crisis into propaganda, people at the edges adapting faster than the centers. But the past is not a prophecy. The Bronze Age did not fall because all complex societies must fall. It fell because particular institutions in particular environments under particular pressures could not absorb enough shocks at once. That is the real archaeology behind the phrase ancient apocalypse. Not a mystery solved by one villain. A system so successful that it became dependent on its own connections. A network so rich that disruptions traveled through it. A palace world so centralized that when the centers failed, whole ways of recording, ruling, and remembering failed with them. And yet the end was also a beginning. Out of the burned palaces came smaller kingdoms, new alphabets, new trade routes, new political forms, and the early Iron Age world. The apocalypse was not the end of civilization. It was the end of one version of it.